Good morning and welcome to another Seize the Day. Today is Thursday, December the 8th, and we get an opportunity to sit down and open the Word together. As you can see behind me, the sun is pouring in, so it's a bright, sunny day today. A lot different than yesterday, although we'll never complain about the rain when it comes. It serves great purposes. This is a busy week for us at Bethany Church. Friday and Saturday, we have our annual Christmas drive-through. Only this year, we've added an after drive party so that those who come through our campus in Greenland, we have about 40,000 lights set up. Just a fun time to begin the Christmas season. And then we're inviting everyone in for some refreshments and just some, Christmas fun. And we even have Linus reciting Luke chapter 2 in the old classic, the Charlie Brown Christmas. So we have some really neat artists who kind of decorated the inside. And so there's just a lot of work that has gone into this. And we're hoping just to make some new friends during this Christmas season. Speaking of Christmas, we're in the midst of Advent, and this year we have taken on the title of God's People Living Generously. And we took as a guide an illustration that was used in a book called The Genius of Generosity by Chip Ingram. In that book, he has a staircase that he uses as a model of generosity, and it begins with God the Father, who loves the world so much that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish but have everlasting life. So from the very beginning, it's in the heart of God, and his generosity, right? His compassion for the world moves him to the place where God sends his Son as the promised Messiah. Now, Jesus comes, and Jesus understands that he has come so that through his life, you and I would experience true life. We would experience this life in abundance. And so that's what Jesus comes to do, right? So God the Father gave his most cherished possession. Jesus gives his Son. And then we saw in Mary, it was her future. Everything is turned around. She gave up her future. Joseph, his reputation, the shepherds, their time, and Magi, their money. So you see, generosity extends far beyond just our money. It touches our treasure, it touches our time, it touches our talents, it touches the very core of who we are, our life, our most cherished possessions. And so this theme then, especially during the season of Christmas, that has been so illustrated by the incarnation, we thought, well, hey, there is a parable that's found in Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 9, where Jesus speaks about a dishonest manager. And this dishonest manager has already proven himself to not be very reliable. In fact, I'd like to just turn, for those of you who are tuning in later in the week, I'm just going to read the story for you, and then we can come back to discuss a few of the elements in it. It's called the parable of the shrewd manager. So Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So this manager doesn't have a very good reputation, does it? Word has come back regarding his inability really to manage the affairs of this rich man. And so that crisis of a situation brought about this scene. It says, so the rich man calls him in and asks him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer. So now he's in a crisis mode. He's about to lose his job. And the manager says to himself, what shall I do now? He says, my master is taking away my job, and I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. And then it's as if this little light goes on in his head, and he goes, oh, I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So what is the motivation here? The motivation is to provide a very soft landing for himself, right? To manipulate circumstances so that he would be welcomed into, their people's houses. And so he goes and he calls each one of his master's debtors. And he asks the first, how much do you owe my master? Like one of the things that kind of escaped me when I was looking through this passage, and John Cogan, one of the pastors at Bethany, brought out in a discussion, and that is that the idea that this manager was not only dishonest, but not very good at his job. I mean, notice he's got to call in his master's debtors and ask them what they owe. Like you would think if he was any kind of a manager, he would know what these people owed. But this just underscores the point that he cannot be manager anymore. He's not doing any kind of service for his master. So he calls him in. He says, how much do we owe you? And the debtor says, 800 gallons of olive oil, which we saw takes about 150 olive trees to produce. So that gives you an idea of how much riches the rich man has. The manager tells him, sit down, and he quickly gave him a 50% discount. Told him to scratch it out from 800 to 400. And the same with the wheat, where he brought it down another 20%. And the master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. Think about that. That is such a weird turn on this story, that the rich man commends the honest man because he had acted shrewdly. He wasn't commending his solution, but the way in which, he took hold of this crisis and tried to work it out for his own benefit. It says more about, value systems here too, doesn't it? And then notice what Jesus adds to this. He says, for the people of this world, obviously putting this dishonest manager into that same boat, as well as, I would say, the master. He says, the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. And that right there is the hinge on which an interpretation of this parable is going to rest. There is now a distinction being made between the people of this world and the people of the light. Jesus has many times throughout the various gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, have begun to expound on there is this broad way that leads to destruction, and many people find it. And there is this narrow way that leads to life, and few there be that find it. There's always a demarcation, right, between the way of God and the ways of the world. I think of that famous text that's found in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, where he says, do not be conformed any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you might be able to prove what God's will is, that which is good, acceptable, and perfect. So this idea of being conformed to the pattern of the world is very real, right? And so in this parable, Jesus is drawing this distinction between those who act shrewdly when it comes to worldly things. And he says, why is it? He says that the people of the world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. And then Jesus goes on to add, and this is found now in Luke 16:9. I'll put the verse there so that you can take a look at it. He says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. We took a look at this and recognized yesterday that this whole idea of eternal dwellings, right? We looked at a passage from Second Corinthians chapter 14. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, where the Apostle Paul says, look, do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Do you catch that? Here we find this sense of eternity and the temporariness of the world in which we're living. Outwardly, it is true, right? We are wasting away. There is a mortality that each and every one of us, we possess. And yet, what is placed alongside the temporal nature of this world is the eternal one that says will far outweigh all of the light momentary troubles that are achieving for ourselves. So this sense of eternity is something that the Apostle Paul will constantly, refer to. In fact, in the very next chapter, in 2 Corinthians 5, Paul goes on to say, says, now we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. And meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling. And he says, now it is God who made us for this very purpose, has given us his spirit as a deposit, guaranteeing what is to come. So when we read in Luke chapter 16, verse 9, and Jesus is calling us to use worldly wealth before it's gone, so in a way that will welcome us into eternal dwellings. Don't you see he's drawing a contrast between this dishonest manager who's using his shrewdness route and dealing with this worldly wealth to what? Make sure that he's welcomed into the houses of his friends. It's all about life in this world. Jesus now is saying to you and me that unlike that unjust steward, unlike that dishonest manager, we're to be living our lives with this sense of eternity, that our eyes ought to be fixed on the end game. And by doing that, it's going to have an impact on the present. How many times when you were a kid, maybe your parents were working or something and they asked you to do some things around the house and you were procrastinating, and then all of a sudden you look at the time and you realize, they're going to be home soon. We got to get busy. And everybody in the house, starts going around, and whether it was taking the trash out or vacuuming or washing some dishes, whatever it was, you got busy because you saw the time and they were going to be walking through that door pretty soon. Well, that's not very far away from what we're trying to communicate in this passage. Jesus is saying that eternity is a very real reality, especially for those of us whose lives are circumscribed by X amount of time. This is temporal. And he says, so you ought to be using your worldly wealth now to gain friends, so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. So managing God's resources And demonstrating that we care about what God cares about means that we are going to do so with this eternal perspective. Now, speaking to the temporariness of this life, there are a couple of really cool kind of passages that one we could look at. Probably a really famous one is found in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12. I'll put this up on the screen. Ecclesiastes, chapter 12. And just to underscore again that the resources, this worldly wealth, it needs to be used in the present, but for eternal values. This is what I think God is asking you and I to do. The idea of gaining friends, hasn't Jesus been speaking to this all along? We'll talk about the gaining of friends a little bit tomorrow, but for now, I just want to underscore again the transitoriness of this wealth. When he says, "So when it is gone," it's not like if. It's not. It's a when. It's when it's going to be gone. You're not going to be able to take it with you, and so consequently, I want you to just take a look at with me with the text here that's found in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, and notice again that he's speaking about life here, and how temporal this life is, and how we have to be mindful to live this life with eternity in mind. Ecclesiastes is written by King Solomon. Solomon was one of the most wealthy men of his day, right? Owned properties, lands. I mean, just very, very wealthy. And yet, when he was first called, if you read in like 2 Kings, you find that God said that he could ask for whatever, ask for whatever you want. And Solomon asked for wisdom. And God says, because you asked for wisdom and not for all these goods, and he says, I'm going to give you both. And he did. Solomon lived this blessed life. But what Solomon also found was that when he began to take his focus off of God and put it on stuff, life seemed to lose its interest and its value. He begins by telling us in a famous chapter here in verse 2. I mean, in chapter 2. We'll get to Romans, Ecclesiastes 12, but I just want to give you a little context for this book. So listen to these words for Solomon, just to give you an idea of how he understood that all that he's possessing will soon come to an end. He says here in chapter 2, he says, I thought in my heart, come now, I'll test you with pleasure to find out what's good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of our lives. See the contrast between heaven and the few days of our lives? It's a man who's coming face to face with the knowledge of his own mortality and recognizing that there has to be something more to life than just this stuff. So what does he do? He says, look, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves, had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers, a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. And in all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Can you just take a look at that? Chapter 2, verse 10. Out of all the things that he did, and this is now a lifetime, right? To do all the things that Solomon was engaged in, he was investing his life in the acquisition, right? In all these experiences. And he says, look, I didn't deny myself anything. But my heart, he says, it took delight in all my work. And that was the reward for all of his labor. So the sense of satisfaction in this work, that was the payoff. But notice what he says in 11. He says, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. And now, under the sun is a phrase that you will find often repeated in the book of Ecclesiastes. And it has everything to do with this life, this temporal life that we have been given. And Solomon now has invested this life in all kinds of pursuits. And at the end, he says, outside of the joy that it gave me in accomplishing, nothing was gained under the sun. It was like chasing after the wind. It's like you amass all this stuff, and you can't take it with you. You get all these degrees, you put them on a wall, and they're going to die with you. It is a stark reality of our own mortality. And you're not going to find that any place more pointed than at the end of this chapter. Because the point that I'm trying to bring home here is Jesus is just used this parable. And he said to you and me that we ought to use worldly wealth to gain friends so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. If we're living with this sense of eternity, it'll give you an entirely different perspective on how you look at your stuff. And Solomon, early on in this book, came to a place where he just recognized, he says, yeah, there were these great experiences. There was this, great satisfaction in the work that I accomplished, but how is that moving the needle? Because I'm getting old and all this comes to an end. And all I have to do is what? Look back on what I've done, but what is the prospect of a future? Notice what he says here in chapter 12 then. It finally comes to a place where he's going to sum up all the things that he's saying in the book of Ecclesiastes. And he says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach when you say, I find no pleasure in them. So the idea is to get this perspective early on in your life, because it has a way of giving life, rather than waiting to the end of your days and just coming to a place where you say, I don't have any pleasure in them. And then he goes on and kind of gives you a little definition about why he finds no pleasure in them. And he uses a bunch of metaphors here. He says, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark, and the clouds return after the rain. When the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men stoop, when the grinders cease because they are few, and those looking through the windows grow dim. When the doors to the street are closed, and the sound of grinding fades. When men rise up at the sound of birds, but all their songs grow faint. When men are afraid of heights and of dangers in the streets. When the almond tree blossoms, this is interesting. The almond tree, when it blossoms, it turns a silvery white. It says, when the almond tree blossoms and the grasshopper drags himself along and desire no longer is stirred, then man goes to his eternal home and mourners go about the streets. Remember him. Before the silver cord is severed, the golden bowl is broken. Before the pitcher is shattered at the spring or the wheel at the well, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. The conclusion for him is now at the end of the book. He says, now all has been heard, and here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. You see, Solomon has come to that point where he recognizes that all of his life is in preparation of what is to come. There is a day that is appointed for us to stand before the very God who has created us. And so the perspective then that Jesus is giving in the parable is that this life is transitory. The wealth of this world is transitory. And the parable says, look, the people of this world, they do everything they can to improve their quality of life while on earth. But it's pointless. Rather, you ought to be using the wealth of this world in a way that will make certain that you are welcomed in eternal dwellings. Which means then that we're using wealth in a way that demonstrates that we care about what God cares about. And so how are we then using the resources we have? This passage that I just read to you from Ecclesiastes 12, it's a picture of the decline of one physically. How is it that, the sun, the light, the moon, the stars, everything, it says, grows dark. The clouds return after the rain. Many commentators look at that as sign of cataracts that are just, keeping our vision from seeing things. The keepers of the house tremble, legs begin to bow, strong men stoop, the grinders are few, teeth, and those looking through the windows grow dim because you can't see. It says when the doors to the street are closed, the sound of grinding fades. You can't hear. And yet, at the slightest noise, sometimes you're startled. Yeah, there is all these signs of our own physical deterioration. And yet, there is still this appointed time that we will stand before God. So how does it make you then look at your stuff? How does it make you look at this life? It's meant to be not something in fear, because Jesus comes to remove all fear so that you can look to eternity with this sense of satisfaction, which is why, again, we celebrate this birth of Jesus, because Jesus has come to take away the sins of the world. Jesus has come so that you and I would be made right between God and ourselves, so that that day of judgment, when it comes, it doesn't have to be dreaded, but it could be a day that you are welcomed into eternal dwellings. Isn't that what Jesus said at the end? He says, uh, uh, let not your hearts, be troubled. I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, there you will be also. That's the promise. And this parable of a dishonest manager is just underscoring again that while we live in this world, we ought to be living generously, demonstrating the heart of God in the way in which we treat other people. Well, my friends, time's over. So many of you got to go back to work. We're beginning our day. I trust it is a great day. Seize it with the recognition that God is good all the time. Lord willing, we'll spend more time again tomorrow. God bless.